Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Susan Howley, and I am Project Director for the Center for Victim Research. We are so glad you are joining us today for this installment of the Evidence Hour. Remember, we hold these webinars monthly. Check out the calendar on our website to see what's coming up. That's victimresearch.org. Now, before we get into today's presentation, it is my job to quickly review the mechanics of the webinar. First, you'll see that there is a hand icon. In case at some point our speakers want to ask for a show of hands, you just click on that hand icon to raise your hand. So let's try it out. Just raise your hands and let me see that you're out there. All right, very good. About half of you got to the hand icon in time. Great. And now the question and answer box. You can ask your questions at any time, and we will be keeping track of them. If they're not answered immediately, we will bring them up at the end of the webinar. Let's try out the Q&A box right now. So please tell us where you are joining from and whether schools have started in your local community already. Just go ahead and use that question box. All right. So it looks like for most of you, schools have started. A few not yet, and we've got people from all over the country. I see Florida, Maryland, Oklahoma, Virginia, Michigan, Washington. That's terrific. Thanks so much. It's so good to have you all here. Today's session is being recorded. While the session is scheduled for an hour, if we do have a whole lot of questions, we may go over an hour for a few minutes. If you have to leave right on the hour, don't worry. You can come back and watch the recording to see what you've missed. And finally, you will be receiving a feedback poll after this webinar. That will be your opportunity to request a copy of the slides or a certificate of participation. Please do take that feedback poll, even if you don't want the slides or a certificate. Your reactions to what we offer are so important to us and to our presenters. So please do take that. And with that, let me pause for a formal start to the presentation. Welcome to the Evidence Hour, Confronting School Violence and Victimization. The Center for Victim Research is holding these Evidence Hour webinars to showcase systematic reviews and meta-analyses that examine an issue of importance to crime victim service providers, advocates, researchers, and others. Today's topic is particularly timely as our nation's schools ramp up for in-person learning after a difficult year. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Jillian Turnovic and Krista Flanagan. They are both faculty members in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University and are co-directors of the university's Crime Victim Research and Policy Institute. As a researcher, Jillian focuses on youth violent victimization and its consequences. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, the Office for Victims of Crime, and Arnold Ventures. She is also a key volunteer officer of the American Society of Criminology's Division of Victimology, whose work benefits everyone who cares about advancing victim research. Krista is an attorney, educator, and advocate experienced in emergency response and disaster management, community collaboration, and program development. She is a longtime beloved member of the victim advocacy community who was an integral part of the teams responding to victims in numerous mass casualty events. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jillian.
All right, thank you so much. So thank you, Susan, first of all, for those introductions, and thank you to the Center for Victim Research for organizing this fantastic webinar series. Krista and I are honored to be here today, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to tune in and listen to us. So today we're going to be talking about school violence and victimization. I'm going to be focusing the bulk of the presentation on findings from a large-scale meta-analysis that was conducted on the school violence literature that's been produced over the past 6 decades. And then Krista will reflect on what some of these findings mean for practice and discuss how schools can best respond to crises and incidents of serious violence. So before we begin, though, I just have to acknowledge my co-PIs and wonderful collaborators on this meta-analysis, which was certainly a team effort. So Drs. Travis Pratt, Teresa Kulig, and Frank Cullen, as well as acknowledge that this research was funded with support from the National Institute of Justice under their Comprehensive School Safety Initiative. And if anyone is interested in the data that we used for this project, or if they want more information on the studies that were included in the meta-analysis, the information is available on the Open Science Framework. Okay, so this is kind of how we're going to structure things today. So first, I'll give a bit of an overview on the scope of school violence, discuss why we thought a meta-analysis of this literature was needed, go over some of the key findings. Then Krista, I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to assist with translating what these findings mean for policy and practice, discuss some of the challenges associated with doing so, and she's also going to draw on her significant expertise to talk about how schools can better respond to crises and in particular acts of serious violence that may happen. So I'll ask that we handle a lot of the questions maybe at the end. So put them in the chat and I'd be happy to follow up with those later. Okay, so when we think about school violence, and I think for most of you tuning into this webinar, we tend to think about school shootings, right? The most serious forms of violence that occur in schools. And this is not necessarily surprising, given that there have been several tragic and high-profile incidents of lethal violence in American schools. And these have established names like Columbine, Sandy Hook, and Stoneman Douglas as permanent parts of the American violence landscape. And as horrific and tragic as these events were and continue to be, they do represent only one small portion of the several hundred deadly shootings that have occurred in schools, in US schools, over the past 5 decades. And even then, school shootings are just one small part of a much broader problem of school violence in general. And there are, of course, the much more frequent occurrences of more minor but still highly troubling incidents of school-based assaults, bullying, harassment, aggression, and intimidation that students tend to face on a daily basis. So school violence is a much broader and more widespread problem than school shootings alone. And we're going to focus on school violence broadly here in this presentation. So now school violence, like when defined broadly to include various forms of interpersonal crimes and victimization at school, it affects a significant number of students each year. And although school victimization rates have generally been declining, as you can see here in this graph, using the most recent available data from the NCVS, there's still over 760,000 of these incidents that occur each year. And you can see rates of violent victimization tend to be relatively lower than for things like theft, but in total, this still affects a significant number of students. And so just violence and interpersonal aggression and delinquency in general are problems that schools need to contend with. Now, this is also a concern because school victimization, just like victimization that occurs elsewhere, has been linked to a wide array of problematic outcomes for youth, both in the short and long term. So these include things like various mental health, behavioral, school, peer, social, and physical health problems. And for some youth, these consequences may persist well into the life course and pile up into even more disadvantages that extend well into adulthood. So this wide array of negative consequences, coupled with the fear of school shootings and the attention given to those incidents, has really raised the public profile of school violence in recent years. And as a result, there's intense political pressures to do something about the problem of school violence. And so in response, dozens of new school-based interventions have been developed and implemented across the country. And these range all the way from things like anti-bullying educational campaigns, cross-cultural awareness programs, conflict resolution management, to various punitive practices, like things like criminalizing bullying, get tough policies for violent behavior, and schools have also increased their reliance on security measures, or placing police officers in schools around the country. And there are now too, widespread policies and practices that are intended to reduce the death toll should extreme violence occur, like lockdown and active shooter drills. So schools have been under pressure to implement a variety of different types of policies to try and address this problem. But successfully addressing a problem like school violence, just like trying to solve any other problem for that matter, assumes that we have a good understanding of what influences the problem in the first place. Yet we didn't currently have a firm handle on which factors are most strongly associated with school violence and victimization that might be best to target in interventions. And the absence of such knowledge, though, was not necessarily a problem due to the absence of research. So there are hundreds of studies on school violence conducted by scholars working in a wide variety of academic disciplines, including criminology, sociology, education, social work, public health, and psychology, over the past 6 decades. So instead, though, what seemed to be holding us back was the lack of efforts to really systematically organize in a comprehensive way what this big body of literature told us about the nature and sources of violence at school. So without such an effort to kind of make sense of all of this, we were kind of left with a disjointed way of thinking about the problem of school violence, with different explanations for its sources spread across different academic fields, and with such work kind of rarely crossing disciplinary boundaries. So how criminologists may think about why school violence occurred may be very different than how educational psychologists think about the problem. And these people don't talk to one another. So we really felt the need to assess the literature more broadly and kind of bridge those disciplinary boundaries. And yeah, I mean, the lack of consensus on this topic is consequential, because how we think about the sources of a problem has implications for how we think about its potential solution. So in this context, we set out to determine what the existing literature as a whole told us about the sources of school violence and victimization by undertaking a comprehensive meta-analysis of research studies. Although several reviews and smaller meta-analyses of this literature have already been undertaken, there really wasn't efforts to kind of take it all together as a whole and make sense of what the broader spectrum of research has produced thus far. So a meta-analysis, for those of you who are less familiar, is basically kind of a fancy term for just synthesizing the literature using statistics. So it's a quantitative synthesis of research that can provide like a single estimate of the strength of a relationship between a given risk factor, in this case in school violence. So a meta-analysis can help us determine which, like for example, individual level, school level, or community level factors are strong, moderate, or weak correlates of school violence and victimization. And another benefit of a meta-analysis is that it can provide useful information about how effect sizes of certain relationships vary across a body of literature. So here, a meta-analysis can help us see whether the strength of a particular risk factor, such as, for instance, deviant peer associations, may be stronger or weaker for specific forms of school violence, aggression, or delinquency. So this knowledge can help provide insight regarding the need or not for behavior-specific policy or program interventions. We felt that it was kind of needed at this time, given the state of the literature and its maturity over the past 6 decades. Okay, so that said, we had 3 broad research objectives with this meta-analysis. So the first was to just determine what the individual, school, and community factors are, which are most strongly linked to school violence in its various forms. The second was to identify these factors for both school violence perpetration and victimization. And third, to really assess how general these factors are across different forms of school violence and victimization. So in this meta-analysis, we assessed school violence and victimization at the individual level. So most of the risk factors or predictors that we examined were characteristics of students themselves. And so because this literature was so broad, we included a wide range of various criminological, social, psychological, and demographic correlates in an attempt to be kind of as inclusive as possible of the literature. And we let existing theoretical perspectives kind of guide the factors that we chose to assess. And so although these may not be completely comprehensive, we felt that they represented some of the major individual correlates that are assessed across the literature. And you can see some of these are more risk factor oriented and some of these are protective factor oriented, but they're all correlates that theories would assume have some relationship with school violence or victimization. We also included various school level contextual factors that may influence individuals' involvement or school violence and victimization. So things like the climate of schools, how violent schools are, how disordered schools are, where schools are located, school size, and the presence of school security devices like metal detectors and cameras. And then we also assessed several characteristics of communities. And these are communities in which schools and students were embedded. And so these were a little bit less common in the literature, given that we looked at school violence and victimization at the individual level, but these included economic deprivation, community crime, and community disorder. So to be as comprehensive as possible in deciding what we were going to include in the meta-analysis, we set pretty broad inclusion criteria. So all published peer-reviewed studies, basically, that were printed in English, that presented some statistical relationship between any of our identified individual, school, and community factors in any form of school violence, perpetration, or victimization against students specifically were eligible for inclusion in the meta-analysis. So studies that didn't specify if perpetration or victimization occurred specifically while at school or on school grounds were excluded, as were studies of victimization and perpetration that took place online against teachers, or that assess school violence and victimization only at the school level, like rates of violence within a particular school compared to another. So again, this is only at the individual level. We also focused exclusively on students in primary and secondary schools, so like kindergarten through the 12th grade. Studies that were based on like preschoolers or post-secondary students we did not include. And we also included studies from across the globe. So these are not just studies that are based in the US. Okay, so this was a very large body of literature, and we identified studies to include in a variety of ways. So 3 of us on the research team carried out our own independent searches through 7 different online databases, over 100 different academic journals that we knew published on topics related to school violence, and we reviewed reference lists of prior meta-analyses as well. And so after we compiled all of our searches and removed duplicates, we identified over 4,000 studies that seemed to be candidates for inclusion just based on their titles and abstracts alone. We ultimately excluded a lot of these just because they didn't present any associations between our identified risk factors and school violence. They didn't assess violence against students, or in a smaller number of instances, maybe there just wasn't enough information for us to calculate an effect size. But after all of that, we ended up with 761 studies that contributed nearly 8,800 effect sizes to the meta-analysis. And so just under half of these were for the perpetration of school violence and just over half were for victimization. And the bulk of this literature, a solid portion of it, was based on bullying behaviors. And so that represented the majority of studies in the meta-analysis. And a smaller portion were for serious forms of violence, as you see here. But we categorized outcomes into things like bullying, violence, general delinquency, bringing a weapon to school, exposure to violence, and then other kind of general forms of interpersonal aggression that occur at school. And I'll get more into what these different types of school violence mean for the findings in a bit. Now, consistent with our research objectives, we examined school violence and victimization separately, and we calculated an average effect size for every risk factor in the meta-analysis and then ranked them in order of strength to really figure out, okay, which are the top predictors of this and which are the weakest. And then we also looked at if the effects were stronger or weaker for certain forms of school violence and victimization, given that so many different types were included in the meta-analysis. And if anyone has any questions on how we did this statistically, I'm not going to bore anyone, but I'm happy to discuss that later on in the chat, or there's more detail in our NIJ report on this topic. All right, so first I'll go over some of the findings for school violence perpetration. Now, here's the overall ranking of correlates, like from 1 to 23, with factors that were found to be unrelated to school violence perpetration at the bottom. So again, this is for any form of school violence perpetration overall. And you'll see the top 5 risk factors here are antisocial behavior, deviant peers, victimization, antisocial attitudes, and peer rejection. And so just to give you a better sense of what these findings look like, here's a plot of all of the effect sizes that had a relationship with school violence perpetration. So the vertical line that you see kind of at 0 is at 0. And then the further away to the right or left, you see these little dots, that's the stronger the effect is. So if it's further to the right or to the left, it means that it's the stronger one. And so here you can see how the effects of antisocial behavior, deviant peers, victimization, and antisocial attitudes, followed up closely by substance use, were the strongest risk factors for school violence perpetration. And antisocial behavior is by far the strongest correlate, and you can see how far it kind of sits apart from the rest of the distribution. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, antisocial behavior, first of all, because this is a meta-analysis and we're interested in broad patterns, was also defined broadly. So it included various forms of offending, aggression, and delinquency. So its strong association with school violence means a few things. First, that youth who engage in antisocial behaviors outside of school likely engage in similar behaviors inside of school. Secondly, that antisocial behavior is in the past is a strong predictor of future antisocial behavior, particularly at school, and that also youth are versatile when it comes to the types of aggression, delinquency, or violence they commit at school. Notably, though, antisocial behavior was more weakly associated with bringing a weapon to school relative to other types of school violence, and this suggests that maybe weapon carrying may be more difficult to predict based solely on youth's past antisocial behaviors or participation in other forms of school aggression or delinquency. After antisocial behavior, deviant peers and antisocial attitudes had some of the strongest associations with school violence perpetration, and these effects were consistent across all forms of delinquency and aggression that were assessed. So, you can possibly define these associations through the lens of like social learning theory. So it's possible that through associations with deviant peers, youth can learn definitions favorable to deviance, be exposed to deviant behavioral models, and receive reinforcements for engaging in deviant behavior. Antisocial attitudes refer to the definitions that youth attach to antisocial behavior. So the more that kids define antisocial behavior as good, like permissible and excusable, and the less they define it as bad and negative, the more likely they are to engage in it. Similar in strength to deviant peers, victimization was a strong correlate of school violence. And this means that kids who have been bullied, abused, or harassed in the past, either at school, at home, on the streets, or online, they're more likely to harm other students and engage in destructive behaviors at school. Again, though, we found that this effect was weaker for weapon carrying. So it may be that weapon carrying is shaped more by factors other than one's victimization experiences, such as deviant peer influences or antisocial attitudes. Peer rejection too was among the top correlates of school violence perpetration, and this was notable for me as a criminologist because its effects really outweighed those of more traditional risk factors like self-control or protective factors like bonds to parents, bonds to school, and academic achievement. Its effects were also consistent across all types of school violence, indicating that it's an important factor to address.
Jill, this is Susan. I just want to break in for 1 sec because we've gotten a couple of questions about the definition of a deviant peer. If you can just answer that, thanks.
Yeah. So deviant peers we defined as just having friends that engage in deviant behaviors. So a lot of the studies we assessed were like survey based, and so they asked kids, how many of your friends engage in the following types of behaviors, or do you have friends that engage in these kinds of behaviors? And it was like substance use or delinquent behaviors primarily. So just having peers that engage in delinquency and associating with them, like considering them some of your close friends. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, awesome. And so lastly, though, going back to the findings, there was also several things that were just weak and null predictors, and I think these are important as well. And so like things like, popularity didn't matter. LGBT identification, for instance, was unrelated or very weakly associated with school violence perpetration, as were extracurricular activities. And we didn't find evidence that things like school size or school urbanicity or various community characteristics were really meaningfully associated with the perpetration of school violence, indicating that, it happens in various types of schools and various types of communities. Okay, next, I'll just talk about the findings for school victimization. And so again, here's like kind of a ranking. This top 5, you can see like past victimization or other victimization experiences, social competence, which I'll explain and how that's defined in a minute, risk avoidance, antisocial behavior, and peer rejection. And so we see some overlap in some of the top 5 strongest risk factors, but there's also some differences as well. And here's a better visual. And so again, the further away from 0 the dots are, the stronger the association is. And anything to the left of the distribution means that it's a protective factor, and anything to the right means that it's more of a risk factor. So standing apart, you can see prior other victimization, social competence, and victimization by far being the strongest. And I'll get into what some of these mean. So because victimization also was defined broadly in our meta-analysis, this means that youth who have been victimized in the past are at risk of being victimized again. That youth who have experienced victimization in other contexts, such as at home, on the streets, or online, these are also kids who are most likely to be victimized at school. And also youth who are victimized at school tend to experience it as well in multiple forms. So they tend to experience it physical aggression, verbal aggression, relational aggression. They should be the targets of that, all different forms. And these effects were also consistent across all types of victimization. Now, social competence emerged as a very strong protective factor, and one that was outmatched in strength only by prior or other victimization. Now, social competence refers to the ability of kids to communicate effectively, maintain positive interpersonal relationships, and collaborate and problem solve with others. So kids who are high in social competence are far less likely to be victimized at school. Now, this also means that kids who are low in social competence, who don't have strong social skills, who have difficulty, kind of taking the perspective of others, and who struggle with being collaborative and helpful, these kids are at risk for being targeted and harassed at school. And related to this, peer rejection also emerged as a top risk factor for school victimization, and had, an effect that was similar in strength to antisocial behavior. And so these findings really emphasize the importance of interpersonal skills and peer group dynamics in shaping risks and vulnerability to school victimization. Now, antisocial behavior was also a relatively strong correlate, which is consistent with research on the victim-offender overlap that suggests that youth who are most likely to be victimized at school also tend to engage in delinquent behavior or violent behavior themselves. But still, the overlap is far from perfect, and the magnitude of this effect suggests that engagement in antisocial behavior does not always coincide with school victimization, but still it's a risk factor. I also just want to mention quickly, risk avoidance was something that we found that had a strong and positive association, and risk avoidance refers to just kids' inability to, or they want to avoid certain contexts at school. So this could be avoiding going down certain hallways, avoiding going to school, avoiding certain people or places at school. And typically this is out of fear of victimization. And so we just want to, although this had a strong correlation in the meta-analysis, we just want to emphasize that it's unlikely that that risk avoidance kind of increases the risk of victimization at school. It's likely that youth take efforts to avoid people or places at school, or they avoid going to school because they have been victimized or the threat of victimization is high to them. All right. There are also, several weak and null correlates of victimization here. So things like substance use, self-control, deviant peers, antisocial attitudes, these things just didn't perform well when it comes to victimization. Extracurricular activities were unrelated, as were bonds to parents were really weak, and then there are also demographic factors that were unrelated. Among some of the weakest predictors in the meta-analysis were school security devices, which were basically unrelated to victimization at school and had an effect size that was essentially 0. Okay, now in the main meta-analysis, we found that LGBT identification was a relatively moderate risk factor for school victimization. And so we wanted to kind of dig deeper into what this meant in a separate study. So in a different meta-analysis, we kind of built upon this main one and looked further into this association by looking at the nature of LGBTQ identification. So we found that the risks of victimization at school were the highest for youth who identified as transgender and the weakest for youth who identified as questioning. And these effects were also strongest for homophobic forms of school victimization. So I think that an important takeaway here is that youth who identify as transgender are particularly at risk for being the target of victimization at school. All right. Now, having said all of this, there are a few things to consider. So correlation does not necessarily equal causation. So meaning these are associations that we identified, but we can't definitively say that they're causal. Also, because we looked at school violence and victimization at the individual level, things may be different at the school level. So community factors or school factors may emerge as more significant predictors of rates of victimization at school overall. Also in this literature, studies of school shootings and serious violence were underrepresented. And so there's definitely more research needed on more serious forms of violence at school. As well, a lot of these studies didn't specify directly a lot of the processes that are assumed to link various risk factors to school violence. And there's still a lot of questions that remain about the situations and contexts at school under which violence and victimization are most likely to unfold. In addition, these associations may well vary by age. So there are certain factors that may be more relevant to predicting violence or victimization among middle school or high school students than earlier elementary school students, especially when you think about in middle school, peer dynamics and school social hierarchies become increasingly more important. And so those peer factors may be more relevant to students at that age of adolescence. And of course, future research needs to examine these things. Now, okay, having said all of this, what does this all mean? Now, the results of the meta-analysis have several important implications for policy and practice, especially when it comes to school-based interventions that are intended to reduce school violence and victimization. So there are a few key things that we can consider. So the first concerns possible factors that interventions should target for change. So given that things like antisocial behavior, victimization, peer rejection, and social competence were found to be strong correlates of school violence, interventions could possibly incorporate facets of emotional control, conflict management, stress coping, and social skills training. And programs that do so are likely to be effective because they can instill and enhance the kind of socio-emotional skills that are necessary for youth to better navigate peer groups and social hierarchies and form positive relationships with others. Still, though, we recommend at least being cautious of interventions that center only on youth, as these may be insufficient at fully addressing the top risk factors for school violence uncovered in the meta-analysis. So, you know, although we didn't necessarily find that community factors were directly related to school violence, we know that the development of antisocial behavior in general is rooted in various familial and community processes. So interventions should be probably holistic and inclusive of peers, teachers, school administrators, and the broader neighborhood. Because microsystems like peers, the family, the school, and the community set the stage for violence and its strongest risk factors to develop, even if indirectly. Now, there are several examples of empirically supported programs that are consistent with our results, and these programs tend to be based in social developmental models or social ecological approaches that target youth's attitudes, behaviors, and social emotional skill development. These programs also tend to involve training for teachers in classroom instruction and management, and include parent training components as well. Now, these are several promising approaches that have proven to be successful over a long term using rigorous evaluation research. But despite these approaches, there remains substantial roadblocks to effective school violence prevention. And a longstanding concern is that many of the known effective strategies for reducing school violence are not implemented nearly as widely as they should be. So many communities kind of lack the infrastructure needed to successfully adopt, implement, and sustain these evidence-based interventions, and stakeholder group preferences, budgetary issues, support from leadership, and the school organizational climate can certainly impede the quality of training and prevention activities. And even at higher organizational levels, there are budget priorities that can mandate or restrict funding for particular school programs. And perhaps the most widely scaled school safety programs are punishment-oriented and law enforcement-based, which include zero tolerance, mandatory suspension and expulsion policies, and the expansion of police officers in schools. And some of these can counteract or compete with some of the more effective evidence-based interventions that are proven to reduce school safety. So, you know, there's not a lot of evidence that these more punitive approaches tend to reduce school violence as effectively as some of the other developmental and social ecological frameworks that have informed the more successful intervention programs. But having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Krista as she can discuss, you know, should school violence happen, what are the role of schools in responding to that. So I'll turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I appreciate that. It's great information. And thanks to all of you for being here today. And it's an honor for me to be here with you. So as Jill said, what does all of this mean related to schools and responding to incidents of violence. Well, beyond the prevention and intervention evidence-based programs that Jill discussed, we have learned from experience how important crisis planning is. From responding to a number of school shootings myself and working with schools, that we have learned that schools might not be as prepared as that they hope that they are. Now, this is particularly due to one of the complicating factors that I'm going to discuss in a little bit, and this has to do with lack of partnerships with outside agencies, particularly victim-serving agencies. So while schools may have effective internal communications, relationships with non-school practitioners may be lacking. So I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm going to be operating from a couple of different basic assertions in regards to the roles that schools play in a crisis. First, children represent a highly vulnerable population whose symptoms and risk for psychological trauma are greater than those of adults, and often have a lasting impact on their development and growth in a number of areas. And second, schools are often the center or the hub of communities. And while not every crisis in a community happens in a school, or it is the usual range of school experiences, the potential is there to affect large numbers of students and the students' families. So schools play a critical role in crisis response because of this standing that they have in the community and in the lives of students and their families. The National Association of School Psychologists, or NASP, they've created a training curriculum to meet the mental health needs of students in a time of crisis. So the NASP has a Prepare, it's called Prepare, P-R-E-P-A-R-E, curriculum for school crisis response. And this Prepare plan, this is an evidence-based curriculum, it emphasizes that schools provide one of the most important parts of mental health recovery by providing a type of safe haven, a place of typical safety and security and predictability. It's the ability to affirm health and welfare for students, as well as the opportunity for those to connect with known systems and also with their peers. Schools have the ability to provide accurate and appropriate information and to educate communities on elements of the crisis event and to include typical developmental responses and strategies for coping and growing. Schools also have a unique ability to access the student population and to determine a risk of psychological trauma and to provide those kind of tiered supports and resources, including referrals to mental health services, victim advocacy, and other community resources. Schools can help identify families that might be displaced as a result of a crisis event and even support maybe some relocation with appropriate information sharing. Schools are able to see and engage students and families over long periods of time, and then they can evaluate their recovery and growth and then intervene if warranted and necessary. But most of all, schools are consistent and predictable environments that can provide for the health, safety, and welfare of students and ultimately the community. Next slide, please. So there are some, the schools have some resiliency factors that we can look at as to why they're good at responding to school crisis. So there are the unique and important aspects of the role that schools play in a crisis event, regardless of where the event occurs, whether it's in or out of school, is that schools have, as I said before, have access to students in ways that many others don't. And they also that access can extend to families as well as the community. Schools have oftentimes a respected reputation in the community and will be listened to. Schools can provide a variety of educational and empowering activities and interventions, such as the psychoeducational documents, psychoeducational groups, classroom meetings, and even some caregiver trainings. By partnering with other schools and school districts, because they do have a tendency to communicate with each other, there can be some collaborative planning and response, and then you can have more of a consistent planning across school districts, not to mention having consistent resources and supports. Schools are also able to evaluate for psychological trauma in real time and support families throughout this process because of their background knowledge of students and their familiarity with them. So as a result of this, schools can engage students and families in appropriate goals and strategies for recovery and ongoing support. And in schools in general, but especially in our secondary setting, students are a part of each other's support system. And we've also seen that there's some research that supports that victims of violence often look to survivors of other violence as a trusted resource. Next slide, please. So there's also some complicating factors that make it a little challenging for schools to respond. And I think this is supported by some of the research that Jill spoke about. It's because it's hard sometimes for schools to be activated when a crisis occurs. Administration, faculty, staff, students, and community will have different needs, and there are different priorities as well. So how do you determine whose needs are going to be met first and what ongoing needs are going to be met can be very challenging. As mentioned in this research, a complicating factor can be pre-existing and ongoing community violence. And this could be, as was mentioned, an indicator of an individual's committing violence, and it certainly can be an exacerbator of victim trauma. And this can lead to complicated or compounded grief, past trauma being activated, which can increase that acting out behavior, perhaps in harming someone else or harming oneself. There are many schools also that don't have the necessary resources to provide an adequate education in general, let alone to implement some of the evidence-based prevention and intervention programs that were mentioned earlier. And often schools have a tendency to deny or minimize the impact of any violence that may be occurring. And this can be for a variety of reasons. Often though, it does have to do with lack of resources and therefore not having the ability to address the problem beyond reacting to each individual act of violence as it presents itself. Next slide, please. One of the most common challenges among educators, including teachers, mental health providers, and support staff and administrators, is their need and determination to take care of themselves. I've seen this in a lot of incidents where schools, the priority, and understandably, is to take care of students first, but then they neglect the care of themselves. And while this may seem admirable, it's really ineffective and actually can be potentially damaging to the adults that are in these leadership roles if they don't take care of themselves throughout the response process. So it's important when schools are creating their plans that they address this as much as they do anything else, so that they're considering their efficacy and how they conduct their services, interventions, and support. Many times it's the educators who are also experiencing trauma, and their capacity to be effective might be compromised, and it's their need to be prepared to step in and tap out if they need to, if it's necessary. And so if they're planning effectively, this will be an expectation rather than a surprise and create some potential conflict. Schools also will struggle to engage families and communities. Now, this is really indicative of the need for schools to be a positive and welcoming environments. Now, I know that I mentioned that schools can be positioned to be positive conveners, but this doesn't always happen in every community, that it can be common for there to be conflict between a school and a community. It's particularly common that following a major crisis such as a school shooting, that schools may be seen, justified or not, as being somewhat at fault. Ultimately, schools are seen, they want to get back into the business of educating students and return to pre-crisis levels of functioning. And that we know that while recovery is the norm, that some students are going to need more, and a few of them will even need more still. And so schools have to balance out, again, the needs of the students to provide that psychological triage and assessment on an ongoing basis. So the key here is prior planning, and those partnerships are paramount to the success of an effective response. Partnerships require ongoing attention to the myriad of issues related to collaboration and coordination. And this is looking at the immediate as well as long-term needs of the students, faculty, and staff in the community at large. Schools have a tendency to circle the wagons when a crisis occurs, no matter how small or how big it is. And they're reluctant, and even in a major crisis, to accept and they're reluctant and resistant to accepting that outside support. And this is primarily due to lack of trust and lack of familiarity with outside agencies. And so this is why it's critical to create those relationships prior to an incident, not in the midst of responding to a crisis. There are a lot of victim services providers here today at this webinar, and you're encouraged to establish relationships with schools now, because it's more likely that you can reach out to them than they are going to reach out to you. School counselors and administrators are a good place to start, but also with teachers and other staff. There are some great programs where advocates can go into schools, such as My Day in Court, that can be a part of a civics curriculum, or even a program that goes, it's in the lower grades, like Hands Are Not for Hitting, which is a prevention program of teaching children to do positive things with their hands rather than acts of violence. Next slide, please. So response plans that you're putting together, they should be comprehensive. For many in education, the opportunity for growth and preparedness isn't recognized really until something happens, and that's when it exposes the gaps of what still needs to be done. It's kind of one of those, you don't know what you don't know. And one of my favorite school leaders has said that he has found that it's important to intentionally keep working, growing, and learning. And so creating those comprehensive plans that are trauma informed, that create those partnerships, that have training that's related just to disaster response, especially when we're looking at preparing for some of the more major responses. Basic mental health training, while it's helpful, is not enough when we're looking at some of the more major crisis events. So looking at some of the psychological first aid, disaster mental health response, tapping into those in the community that have been trained in that area, and having those partnerships and relationships early on is critical. Schools knowing, again, their students and their families and their communities, and being sensitive to what any cultural differences there might be, or developmental issues that might be present related to mental health and personal growth. And finally, determining what data it is that you're going to be using to guide the response to students. That can be indicators to schools, so that schools are informed, so that they can continue to plan. That's important, and to implement and to adjust whatever responses they may be having along the way. There's always an opportunity to learn, even from an effective response. And also that it's highly recommended that programs and plans are being evaluated as they're being created, and every time that a portion of a plan is being implemented, that it be evaluated in all aspects of the response. Next slide, please. So in summary, I know there's been a lot of information for you all today. When developing response plans, there's some considerations for you that schools should have already crisis plans in place, but how comprehensive are they? We want to make sure that they encompass preparedness, prevention, intervention, response, and recovery, both in the short and the long term, and have the ability to examine how the process is going to ensure that there's appropriate and in real time, but also in the future, adjustments and learning. Establishing those partnerships ahead of time with appropriate responding agencies, such as victim services agencies, and making sure that those relationships outside of the schools are created. School safety and crisis teams need to be adequately trained in the different types of crises, systems, procedures, and any type of unique mental health needs that could arise as a result of a crisis, as well as having the ability to examine the effectiveness of these interventions, response, and recovery. Ideally, key responders will be trained, as I said, in disaster response, as well as psychological first aid. Plans also really should be fully integrated into existing community response plans, that the existing emergency plan should know what the school response plans are going to be in case they have to be activated. And this should include public safety, fire rescue, community mental health service providers, as well as a clearly have this communicated to staff, parents, and community leaders so that everybody knows what the response is going to be. And finally, based on the research discussed today, schools may want to consider having students being a part of some part of the planning process so that they can be invested, because this really may help develop some of that social competence that was mentioned earlier. Next slide. So unfortunately, school violence is going to continue, and no matter what type of prevention and intervention programs that we can see, that will continue, and we can only imagine what's going to be happening now with schools coming back after being away for a year with all of the complicated anxiety and stress that they've been experiencing over the past year with the pandemic. But it's important that we continue to ask questions, that we learn from the findings, and that we collaborate in developing those policies and practices. So thank you so much for your time and attention. Are there questions? Or I don't know if Jill, if you had any final comments before we open it up to questions.
No, I'm happy to hear from everyone else. I'm sure there people are sick of hearing from me.
No, not at all.
All right, we've had
a lot of information.
Yes.
And we have had quite a few questions come in already, but folks, remember, just use that question tab to enter your questions. The first was from rather early on. Does the initial graph showing a decline in school violence indicate the number of incidents or the rate per 1,000 or 100,000 students?
Is the rate of school violence. And I believe, I have to go back to it, but it's from the Indicators of School Crime and Safety report that just was released in July using the most recent NCVS data. And it was the rate per 1,000 students.
All right, great. Another point came in. I do not disagree that non-punitive programs can be more effective, but I would like to know what evidence-based programs were you specifically talking about that are non-punitive?
So there are several that have been demonstrated using really rigorous empirical research to be proven to be effective. So one of these includes the Seattle Youth Development Project, which was implemented in a variety of schools across Seattle in various different communities and cultural contexts. And youth were evaluated not only from the time they were throughout school, but actually well into adulthood. And so there were various components of that program that focused on youth development, interpersonal skills, teacher training, family skills training, and that also incorporated stakeholders from the broader community. The Steps to Respect program is one that has been implemented widely. The Fast Track program, which kind of stands for Families and Schools Together, is another one, in addition to the PATHS program, that stands for Promoting Alternate Thinking Strategies. And the Fast Track program and the PATHS program have actually kind of been integrated together and proven to be successful. There's also a Coping Power program. So this information is in the slides. And what's great about a lot of these programs is that there's really helpful websites and information available that's freely accessible to the public for people to learn more about these programs. And if any of you have any more questions about some of these, you can feel free to email me directly, and I can also provide you with some of that information.
Great. We did have another question about in what states are some of these programs being implemented?
Yeah, so there's actually a wide range of states, and a lot of them, though, are evaluated on a local level, and scaling them up to the state level is actually quite rare. And even in some locales, implementing them in multiple school districts as well has been a challenge. So I think a limitation of some of this work is that they are kind of evaluated on a smaller scale, maybe in one particular school district or in a set of schools within a given city. And yeah, scaling up, especially like to a state level with some of these multi-systemic programs that often require a lot of resources and a lot of buy-in, not only on the part of schools, but on the part of communities, is definitely a challenge. I mean, scaling some of these programs up to the state level is difficult. And I think that's why we tend to default to more blanket policies like zero tolerance based approaches or increasing the presence of school resource officers, which is much more feasible in terms of its scalability.
We had another comment. It is difficult to believe that school violence has been steadily decreasing since the 1990s through 2020, although one may say it is the awareness and media which makes it seemingly feel like school violence is increasing. Do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, so I mean, school violence, when we conceptualize it broadly, it really tends to follow a lot of the similar trends to crime in general. So crime in the 1990s was actually a lot higher than it was today, even though we've seen increases in violence in different cities around the US, particularly in 2020 and this year as well. But yeah, crime in general was a lot higher in earlier decades than it is today. And so the trends in school violence tend to follow that same pattern. Now, when you look at lethal violence in particular, the trend is a lot more stable. So these incidents are relatively rare, but the decline in those incidents are it's less dramatic than you see for violence and forms of delinquency overall in schools.
Now, this question is going back to much earlier, but what types of models or multivariate analyses did you use in the analysis?
So we did like a hierarchical meta-analysis. We included, so this was effect sizes nested within studies. We also ran additional models that were effect sizes nested within studies, nested within data sets to take into account different issues of statistical dependence. We also accounted for differences between bivariate and multivariate effect size estimates and assessed those sensitivity on the findings. Yeah, that person can email me directly with questions. I don't want to bore everyone, especially, our wonderful victim advocates who are here today who may not want to hear more about that.
Here's another question. What demographic factors were not factors? You talked about the ones that really made a difference. What about race and grade level and a child's growth percentage?
So age didn't really matter directly, and so race and sex didn't really matter that much either. But I caution against, kind of concluding that those factors are unimportant. I think with a meta-analysis, what we can really do is establish direct relationships. And I think factors like race, for instance, are probably going to matter in certain contexts more than others. So if students are in a classroom like a primarily white classroom, and you're a student of color and you're in a very visible minority, your risk of victimization is likely going to be much higher than it is if you're in a different context, like where you're a less visible minority. And so on average, we didn't see race really playing a factor, but it's likely that we weren't able to kind of look at the situations or contexts under which things like race or immigrant status, are really make kids more vulnerable. And there is research that shows that maybe in schools like in the South, for instance, in different regions of the US, there are, certain factors that place people more at risk than in other cultural and social contexts. And a meta-analysis is really good at establishing broad patterns, but less so in kind of teasing apart those relationships. So, yeah.
All right, we've gotten quite a few questions of people seeking slides. So I just want to remind folks that when you get that link for the feedback survey, please click on that. That will be your opportunity to request a copy of the slides. Another question, and this may be more for Krista, if a child is victimized by violence, do you believe it's appropriate to tell a victim that criminal charges can't or won't be pursued? Or how do you handle that?
You know, what we know working with victims is information is important to them, and to be honest and forthright. So as much information that's appropriate for that child and at their age group, yes, that information should be shared with them. Again, in an appropriate, age-appropriate manner.
Okay. This one says that this acknowledges this is a bit of an opinion question, but with schools reopening after COVID, is there more resistance to prevention programs than in pre-COVID times? And have you noticed that yet? And if so, how could that be combated?
Well, some of the work that I've been doing with schools right now, really the focus has to do more with how to get through these days with COVID. And so really almost anything else related to school violence or any other issue has really been put on the back burner. And this can be concerning because this is being neglected, that maybe people aren't looking for some of the indicators or you know, having even some of the mental health resources available that they've had in the past, because the focus is so much in dealing with the issue around COVID.
And Krista, a somewhat related question. Can you speak more about the implications for violence prevention of this kind of research and then these times?
Yes, and I think Jill can chime in on this as well. You know, violence prevention is really difficult to measure. I mean, the success of that, because you have to be looking at such a long term. But we have seen, I think, that it's effective, but it's also, as Jill was talking about with some of the programs, is that it can be difficult to implement them. It can be costly, and it takes such a comprehensive involvement and commitment of so many factions of the school as well as the community. But it really can be empowering too for students to feel that they have some sort of ownership in their own types, in their community, but also in their own safety and security, which goes to facilitating some of those factors that Jill spoke about with the social competence, et cetera.
Do you have oh, go ahead, Jill. Anything to add?
No, that's good. No, I don't have anything to add. I think that's great. Yeah.
Do you have any insights into studies that focused on violence that may impact female students more, such as dating violence?
Yeah. So a lot of these studies focused on bullying, and we kind of lumped bullying together as like one factor because we are assessing so many different things. But when you actually look at bullying by type, female students in particular were much more likely to be victims of like interpersonal aggression and bullying and social exclusion, rumors, teasing, rather than physical forms of bullying. And so we definitely did see that difference. And, in general, I think the gender differences, so males were much more at risk to be victims of more serious violence in schools, and females more at risk for more relational types of aggression and bullying. We did also include in our measures of violence, like sexual assault and sexual harassment of students at school, and those were, of course, disproportionately overrepresented in female students as victims.
And we got another question about additional materials. Can you go to that last slide? I think you had some publications on there.
Yeah, so I list our meta-analyses. So what's available through CVR right now is our final report that we produced for NIJ. But in publishing the findings of our meta-analysis, we provided an update to that literature too. So our NIJ report goes through 2016. Our final findings that I presented today go through studies published through January of 2019. And so I'd be happy to provide anyone with this report, this large monograph that's published with Cambridge University Press, as well as our separate meta-analysis on the victimization of LGBTQ students at school.
All right, and I'll remind folks that the emails for both of you will be on the slides. If you take the feedback survey and request the slides, you will have those email addresses handy. All right, it looks like that is it for the questions coming in. I want to thank both of you for this extensive thought-provoking presentation that is so timely right now as we go back to school and we remember that we need to think about the kids and our school climate and preventing school violence and coming together as communities on issues that really matter. So thank you both for your time today. This has just been terrific.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
All right, goodbye everyone.
Bye.